Welcome to today's live webinar on Division II Financial Aid. My name is Karen Wolf. I'm an Associate Director in Academic and Membership Affairs, and I'll be joined today by my colleague, Angela Red. So I want to start here with a couple of famous movie quotes. I don't know how many movie buffs we have on the line today, but certainly see a few there that hopefully I think are all in our stream of conscious, even if we have or haven't seen the movie, right? So just keep swimming from Finding Nemo. That's probably something we've all been telling ourselves a lot over the last 3 months. You Had Me at Hello from Jerry Maguire. There's No Place Like Home from The Wizard of Oz, although some of us, again, over the last 3 months, maybe are getting a little tired of being at home. But then, of course, a really great one from Forrest Gump. Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. So you're probably wondering, what the heck does this have to do with financial aid? Well, we're going to take a little spin off of our friend Forrest Gump, and we're going to relate financial aid to pizza today. So financial aid is like pizza. You never know what you're going to get, but certainly our goal here today is to demystify it as much as we can and hopefully answer some of those questions that we see most commonly as staff coming through RSRO. So quick overview here today before I turn it over to my colleague Angela. The first thing we're going to do is Angela's going to take you through preparing the ingredients. So in this case, the legislative overview as it relates to financial aid. We're then going to shift into some practical applications, so making that pizza through case studies. And then once we make the pizza, we're going to shift to dinner conversation and hit those hot topics in the area of financial aid to close out the presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to Angela to walk us through the legislative overview.
Thank you, Karen, and good afternoon, everyone. Happy to be here with you all today. As Karen mentioned, my name is Angela Red, and I'm an Associate Director on the Division II team in Academic and Membership Affairs. So we're going to get started with preparing the ingredients. As Karen mentioned, this is the legislative overview. So the first thing is you need to deliver a whole pizza. And with that, athletics aid must be awarded for a full academic year per the legislation. But there are times when you may not want to deliver the whole pizza. So what if you only want to deliver half of the pizza? So keep in mind we have those exceptions, and if you want to only deliver half of the pizza, must meet one of the exceptions that are listed in Bylaw 155311. As you can see on the screen there are a few examples, the most common being the one-time exception, but then we also have the mid-year enrollee as well as the final semester and quarter. One thing I will just note here with the examples, again, I mentioned the most common is that one-time exception. The thing to note here, this can only be used truly one time in a student athlete's their career. So just keep in mind as you all are working through, if that student athlete, let's just say, enrolls at your institution their freshman year, and for some reason you needed to use that one-time exception at that point, they have exhausted the avenue to be able to use that one-time exception. So again, it is truly just that one time in that student athlete's career. The next item is just it is permissible to use and combine exceptions throughout that year. So just as you're working through that, there is not a limit on how many can be used. So the placement of toppings. The initial award for the academic year must be distributed equally. Again, that is the initial award for each academic year. So just keeping that in mind as you all work through the end of academic years and are doing renewals. And equal is based on how the aid agreement is written. So let's look at a few examples here. The first example that you see is the award is $5,000. You must distribute $2,500 each semester. So again, in the fall and in the spring. It's the easiest, right? So now let's look at example number 2. If the award is 0.4 equivalency, the institution would have to pay 40% of the full grant in aid, again, that's the actual or average, for each semester. And then example number 3, if you're going to write out awards that you're going to cover full tuition and books, then the institution must cover and pay the full cost of tuition and books for each semester, regardless of the actual cost, even if the amounts are different between the 2 semesters. So again, equal is truly based on how the aid agreement is written for the student athletes. So let's prepare the ingredients. So what if you need to change the order and you want to add toppings? Keep in mind, increases can happen at any time for any reason. Again, that's the NCAA legislation, but again, as an institution or as conferences, you all may have additional restrictions as it relates to reasons for athletics aid agreements to be increased. So just keep in mind, per NCAA legislation, increases can happen at any time for any reason. The next thing is that the increase must be prorated based on the amount that's remaining in the term. You can't pay for something if you've already moved past that portion of the term. And then the last item there, you can calculate a daily rate for that full grant and aid amount to determine how much aid can be awarded for the term. So think of a pizza. If the slice has already been eaten, you cannot add toppings to that portion of the pizza. And you can see as the pizza's there, if you take away those couple of slices, you can no longer pay for that portion. So what if you need to change the order and reduce the toppings or cancel the order? So once the pizza has been ordered and the period of the award has been started, you cannot reduce or cancel athletics aid unless the student athlete has become ineligible, fraudulently misrepresents himself, engages in serious misconduct, or voluntarily quits the team. Again, those are all outlined in the manual, but just keep that in mind that those are the only permissible reasons of which a student athlete's aid agreement can be reduced or canceled. A few other things to just note as it relates to reducing toppings or canceling the order. If a student athlete quits the team during a term, that half of the pizza cannot be given to another team member unless the team is not already at its equivalency limit. So let's look at an example here, and it may be a little bit easier to understand. So if you have a basketball student athlete who is receiving a 0.6 scholarship and quits at mid-year, leaving 0.3 unused, if the team is already at the 10.0 equivalency, which is the maximum limitation for basketball, you cannot re-award the student athlete's remaining 0.3 scholarship for the spring term. However, if the team is only at a 9.0 equivalency, the institution can award up to 0.7 of the equivalency to bring the team total to 9.7. So again, truly depends on whether or not the team is already at the maximum equivalently limit at the time the student athlete quits the team. So again, keeping with reducing or canceling, as always, the institution must notify the student athletes by July 1. If the institution is providing a different pizza that is worth less than the year before, this is considered a reduction. One thing I will just point out with this is in the event, and there are certainly cases where institutions will issue an initial award for the upcoming academic year, and then something changes and the institution needs to do an increase. Just keep in mind, if you're not re-awarding that increased amount in that example, and you only award, let's say, the initial amount you had given, that would be considered a reduction. So just keep that in mind as institutions and you're all working through the renewal process, that if you are truly providing a different pizza that is worth less than the year before, this is considered a reduction. And as always, if athletics aid is being reduced or canceled, the student athlete must be given the opportunity to appeal. And with that, I will turn it back over to Karen, who is going to now take us through our case studies and make the pizza.
So as we walk through these case studies, obviously when you go into a pizza place, you're confronted with a menu, you have decisions to make. So we are going to operate, you can see in that top right-hand corner there, a pizza with 10 slices. So very similar to most of you have probably a 10-month academic calendar. So 2 terms, 5 months in each semester. So that's sort of the visual that we're going to go with here. And then here's our menu. No need to scramble to copy this down. This is going to show up on each of the next slides. But the theory here is that, again, each of these pizza toppings corresponds to an element of athletics aid. These are random numbers for the most part. Certainly, obviously, each institution has their own full grant and aid value that hopefully you are calculating in consultation with your financial aid office on an annual basis. We were intentional there, though, on the Black Olive / books number being $8. As hopefully everyone's tracking on, books are valued at $800 for the year, regardless of actual cost. So that number is set by the NCA manual. That really is meant to help all of you from a practical matter. You know, every single one of your student athletes takes a different class lineup, which corresponds to different books. So you're always plugging in that $800 number for books. So moving ahead here, we're going to do a first practice item here. So when we're looking at the menu, what is the value of the full grant and aid? So we've got our 5 different elements here of tuition, fees, books, room and board, or in pizza terms, tomatoes, feta, black olives, red onion, and bacon. What is the value of that? Well, you're going to total up all 5 of those elements there. So 50, 25, 8, 20, 15, and your full grant and aid for this academic year, or this value of this particular full pizza, is $118. So that's going to be an important number that we're going to keep with us through the next number of case studies. So looking at a particular type of pizza, maybe somebody wants to order tomato and bacon. So you want to give somebody tuition and board. What does that look like? So we know the full value of a grant and aid here is $118. Tomato and bacon is $65 total, so 50 plus a 15, and that equates to a 0.55 equivalency. So our first case study here, Papa John's. Papa John was offered by your institution a pizza with tomato and black olives, so tuition and books. What's the value of Papa John's pizza? Again, we're looking at the particular elements there, seeing what those cost. That does come up to $58. Again, that's 50 for tomatoes, 8 for black olives. So then what's Papa John's equivalency number? We're going to take that $58 we just calculated in terms of what he's been provided. We know the full grant and aid from our previous slide is $118. So Papa John's equivalency based on this pizza with tomato and olives is 0.49. But after the second slice, the institution decides to add meat to Papa John's pizza. So you can see the visual there. Again, he's had 2 slices there, or again, in practical terms, 2 months have elapsed on that aid agreement at the point where the institution wants to add something to that aid agreement. So then what's the value of his pizza now? Not as simple as just adding that $15 for bacon, because again, you cannot provide a full board scholarship to his aid agreement for the year because those 2 semesters have already gone. So it does require a little bit of math, as Angela mentioned earlier. Bacon is valued at $15, which equates to $1.50 a slice, because again, we have 10 slices to start. In this instance, there's only 8 slices that remain. So the maximum amount of bacon that Papa John can be given right now is $12 worth. So similar, if you want to add boards to a student athlete aid agreement, you need to be doing a similar calculation to figure out how much is left of the year to give to that student athlete. So we know in terms of how much his pizza is valued now, it was originally worth $58, calculated that on the last slide. We know we can add $12 of bacon to this pizza, so it's worth now a total of $70. Obviously, then we need to recalculate his equivalency as well, right? So that's just, again, taking the new $70 amount and putting that over that same grant and aid number, because that's never going to change for the year. So 70 over 118 gets us to a new equivalency of 0.59. So what if your coach comes into your office and says, you know, I don't know exactly what I want to give to Papa John for sure, but what's the most that I could give? I want to go back and look at my budget and think about that, the impact here, before I make the decision. So again, the 2 months have elapsed. So at this point, it's going to be $48. Let's walk through that. We know that he's already getting tomatoes and olives on that pizza. So the increased opportunity for him is to add feta, red onion, and bacon, or in financial aid terms, fees, room, and board. So you want to add those elements together, so 25, 20, and 15 for a total of 60. But remember, we need to be looking at that on the prorated basis. So since there's only 8 slices left or 8 months left in this aid agreement, the maximum amount that could have been added to Papa John's aid agreement would be $48. So this is really hopefully highlighting for you that you really do need to be looking at this on a basis of really honestly, in some instances, day by day, if your room and board is valued at that, but you do need to make sure that you're doing these calculations on prorating and not giving student athletes additional aid by being retroactive. So finally here, next year, Papa John has received an aid agreement by that July 1 deadline with his original pizza of tomato and olives. Does Papa John need to be sent a reduction letter? He's receiving the same aid agreement that he got on July 1 of the previous year. He does. And that's because even though he's getting his original aid amount, it's a decrease from what he ultimately received this year. So since he was increased and went up to that, again, the 0.49 equivalency, the 0.59 equivalency after the increase, he's being decreased to that original amount. So he would need to get the reduction letter and, of course, the opportunity to appeal. Okay, moving on to our next case study. This is Luigi. So Luigi signed an aid agreement for this past academic year for a pizza with tomato, feta, and bacon. He decides that he's going to drop part-time after the 6th slice. So he was enrolled full-time for the entire fall. He was full-time for the first month of the spring term, but then he drops to part-time. Does the institution have to cancel Luigi's aid? They don't, actually. It's an institutional choice. So student athletes are required to begin the term enrolled as a full-time student in order to receive athletics aid. That's a base rule as it relates to student athlete eligibility for financial aid. However, Luigi has rendered himself ineligible to compete because, as you all know, you have to be enrolled full-time to compete for the institution. So if the institution chooses to, they may choose to cancel or reduce the aid because Luigi has rendered himself ineligible. But again, institutional choice, not NCAA requirement. So let's say the institution does decide to move forward with canceling Luigi's aid. How much aid can be reawarded to another student athlete, and when can that aid be reawarded? So again, Luigi's aid agreement to start with had tomato, feta, and bacon, so tuition, fees, and board. So that pizza ultimately is worth $90. If we're looking at that, again, on a month-by-month basis, that's $9 a slice. There's only 4 slices, though, remaining of Luigi's aid agreement, right? 6 of them have been consumed at this point in the academic year. So the value that is left for the institution that they have not yet awarded is $36. So again, that $9 with 4 slices remaining. As it relates to when that aid can be reawarded, in this instance, it's immediately, right? Because the student athlete has done something to render themselves ineligible. So Luigi still has to be given the opportunity to appeal. That's true of any cancellation, but you would be able, from an institutional perspective, to immediately cancel his aid because, again, he's rendered himself ineligible for competition. The next case study is La Rosa. La Rosa signed an aid agreement for the 2019-20 academic year for 0.75 of a fully topped pizza. So what's the value of his pizza during this academic year? So again, we're going to take that $118 value that we knew from the outset, multiply that by his 0.75 equivalency, and we find out that La Rosa's Pizza is ultimately worth $88.50 for this academic year. So as is happening certainly in food industry, costs increase, but we also know certainly on campus, your tuition and fee costs can increase as well as in conjunction with your room and board costs. So for the upcoming academic year, the institution raises the costs of tomatoes, feta, red onion, and bacon by 40%. So again, those costs the institution actually controls, they realize we need to increase by 40%. So what is the value of a fully topped pizza then for this upcoming academic year? It comes to $162. And the math here, again, you're going to take the 4 elements to tomatoes, feta, red onion, and bacon, so the 4 elements of athletics aid there, not including books, and multiply that by 1.4, because again, it's increasing by 40%. But remember, the books number is an NCAA legislated number, so that's never going to change unless the legislation changes. So you're not going to increase that number similarly by that 40%. That's going to stay the same. So that brings you to 162 overall value. So comes time for aid agreement renewals. Again, July 1 is coming up in the next few weeks. If the institution offers La Rosa an aid agreement for 0.60 of a fully topped pizza for next year, what is that agreement worth? And is it a reduction, a renewal at the same rate, or an increase to La Rosa's aid? So we know, again, that for the 2021 academic year, a full pizza is worth $162. So in this instance, if she is given 0.6 of a pizza, that comes to $97.20. So that's actually more than she got this past academic year, right? Because the value of her aid agreement for this past year was $88.50. But to go back to what Angela was mentioning about really needing to think about how you are awarding, this still will be a reduction for La Rosa because the 2020-21 aid agreement is ultimately a lower equivalency value, even though it's worth more money. So ultimately, with this 0.60 aid agreement, La Rosa is on the hook for 40% of the costs out of her pocket, whereas last year she was only responsible for 25%. So that's another way to think about it as you're trying to consider whether something is a reduction or not. How does this ultimately impact the student athletes out of pocket? It may be a helpful way to frame the discussion. So on the flip side, again, La Rosa's aid agreement last year ultimately was worth $88.50. So what if the institution turns around and says, that's what we're going to give you for this next academic year? What's her equivalency ultimately, and is it a reduction, renewal, or an increase? So $88.50 over the $162 for the full grant and aid amount for next year brings her aid agreement then to a 0.55. So as a result, that is also a reduction for La Rosa because she was receiving a 0.6 aid agreement last year, and this year would only be receiving the value of 0.5. So even though the aid agreement is worth the same amount of money, she's receiving less of a pizza or receiving less of a full grant and aid amount based on the equivalency. So the only way in her instance to not have a reduction is to give La Rosa an aid agreement for 2020-21 that is worth the 0.75 pizza aid agreement she signed for the previous year. So now that we've made a few pizzas, time to clean up the kitchen with some takeaways. So the first, it's always permissible to re-award immediately after cancellation for all reasons other than a voluntary withdrawal. So again, if the student athlete has done something detrimental that results in their aids being canceled, so again, Angela walked through those, probably the most common is that they'll render themselves ineligible. That is something that the student athlete has done to put the institution's team at a disadvantage. So they are able then to turn back around and re-award that aid. Certainly when you're analyzing whether something's a reduction, make sure you're comparing apples to apples. If the previous award's written as an equivalency, write the next one as an equivalency. If you're writing a dollar value, write the next one as a dollar value. The mixing and matching, I think, is what we see most commonly as what trips people up on whether something is a reduction or not. And then finally, as Angela mentioned in her portion, the one-time exception for the one-year period can only be used one time. So it's not one time per academic year, it is one time during the student-athlete's collegiate enrollment at your institution. So you want to make sure you track on that moving forward. So now moving to some dinner conversation or hot topics. I want to walk through a couple of things to make sure folks are tracking on additional items related to financial aid. The first, as many of you know, the division adopted a proposal at the 2017 convention that significantly changed how equivalencies were calculated in Division II. As you know, right now, only athletics aid counts towards those equivalency limits. So the legislation committee knew at the time that if that proposal was adopted, that was going to be a pretty big change. And certainly there were a number of individuals in the membership who were opposed to such a change based on potential unintended consequences. So the legislation committee, at the request of the Conference Commissioners Association, did request data for the 2018-19 academic year. So that was the first year that this legislation went into effect last fall. So many of you may have been a part of that fact gathering request or that info gathering request, and the legislation committee did review that data at their meeting in earlier this year. There were no immediate concerns noted in the data in terms of a potential disparate impact on our institutions. I think there's been some concern about whether this gives an advantage to private institutions or if it gives an advantage to public institutions. There was nothing that stood out based on that data, but the committee has noted that they will continue to monitor the impact based on data that's collected through the financial reporting system. That will be on their agenda for their November meeting. They've got a lot right now on their plate related to name, image, and likeness, but they certainly did want to make sure that this is something they continue to track on and make sure that if there are any necessary changes that we're tracking on that, and any legislation that may need to be amended can be done so in a timely manner. The next area deals with non-qualifier access to athletics aid in practice. So the Division II Academic Requirements Committee recommended sponsorship of 2021 convention legislation to permit non-qualifiers to receive athletics aid in the first year of enrollment. And the President's Council did agree to sponsor that proposal in concept. So the Management Council and President's Council will review that proposal again at their summer meetings in July and August. So it's not officially on the docket yet for convention in 2021, but it is certainly making its way through the process. Some of the rationale there on this proposal is due to the high number of initial eligibility waivers that are approved to give access to athletics aid. In the last 6 years, 97% of waivers gave access to at least athletics aid, so only 3% were outright denied. And the Academic Requirements Committee really focused on this being an access issue. So we know Division II has the highest number of first-generation college students, and with that does create some financial challenges across our division in terms of paying for college as college continues to increase in cost. So this really was an acknowledgement to hopefully allow all of our student athletes to have that equal opportunity and not have it be dependent on a waiver. It would still be an institutional decision to award aid to a non-qualifier. Of course, they have rendered themselves ineligible by being a non-qualifier, so the institution would still have the opportunity to reduce or cancel that aid if they so chose. And if this proposal is adopted, it's important to note that any aid awarded to a non-qualifier would still count toward team equivalency limits. So it wouldn't be free aid, for lack of a better way to say that, toward the equivalency. They would have to be accounted for. Additionally, ARC is going to talk at on their June video conference, which is actually taking place tomorrow, whether to also extend this recommendation to include practice. We know certainly that the student athlete surveys through GOLD and otherwise do highlight the increased sense of belonging that our student athletes have by being part of a team and by being involved. And in this era where a lot of schools are concerned about enrollment management even prior to COVID-19, maybe this is an opportunity to have additional student athletes feel involved and connected to their teams during their first year. So again, that's still up for ARC's debate on their upcoming video conference, and we'll see what they do with that, but wanted to make sure that was on everyone's radar from a financial aid standpoint. Finally, do want to cover a couple of things related to the impact of COVID-19 on financial aid. First, dealing with equivalency limits for the upcoming academic year. Hopefully everyone's tracking on the fact that the administrative committee approved a blanket waiver to allow student athletes to retain the season of competition from this past spring for those sports whose seasons were cut short. They also approved a blanket waiver to allow those student athletes who would have used their fourth season of competition or exhausted their eligibility clock during this past spring term to receive athletics aid for the upcoming year without counting toward team equivalency limits. So essentially, if you had someone who you were not anticipating having eligibility remaining after this past spring, that they were going to be done, they would have completed their eligibility in whatever sport they participate, but now they have the opportunity to come back based on the season of competition waiver, their aid does not need to count toward team equivalency limits. It is important to note, though, that that blanket relief only applies if the student athlete remains at their original institution. If they ultimately transfer to a new institution to use that final season, which they can do, then legislatively that's permissible and the waiver allows for that. But if they do that, their aid has to count at the new institution. The reason for that, again, is you as an institution, your student athletes who were impacted this spring, you were not planning for that student athlete to potentially come back during the 2020-21 academic year. But if your coach goes out and recruits one of these student athletes to come into your institution for next year, they're doing that eyes wide open, and thus they should count toward the equivalency limits. We've talked a lot today about the July 1 renewal deadline for you to send out financial aid renewals to your student athletes with remaining eligibility. The administrative committee did confirm that that deadline will remain as is. Hopefully, those of you that have not yet completed those renewals are still able to do so. If there's a COVID-19 related reason why you are not able to meet that deadline, certainly you can submit an individual request through our SRO, but our hope is that institutions are up and running enough to be able to get that important information out to our student athletes so that they can plan financially for the upcoming academic year. The final piece there relates to non-athletically related terms and conditions. So as you know, legislatively, you are permitted to include non-athletically related terms and conditions in sort of the fine print of your financial aid agreements. These are typically things like violation of team rules or institutional policy that allow institutions to cancel or reduce a student athlete's athletics aid. It is permissible for an institution to include a condition related to COVID in those terms and conditions. One of the things that we've heard most commonly is, can we include a condition that if our institution does not have on-campus learning in the fall and a student athlete is receiving room and board, that we can cancel that? Because again, they can't live on campus and our dining facilities may not be open. From an NCAA standpoint, inclusion of such a clause would be permissible, but as we always encourage you to do, and for those of you veterans listening to this presentation, I know you've heard us say this a lot, anything related to your terms and conditions on financial aid and otherwise should always be reviewed by your institutional legal counsel. So those decisions really do need to be made at the campus level to determine whether inclusion of such a clause is appropriate or not. So with that, I will turn back to my colleague, Angela Redd. I know there's probably been some questions to respond to for the group.
Yes, thank you, Karen. A couple of things that I just want to note on questions that have come in. The first being as it relates to compliance assistant with the impact of COVID and how to potentially go about logging in the aid, the financial aid that student athletes receive, especially with those who are coming back and are receiving are able to exempt aid as it relates to exhausted eligibility with a season of competition waiver. So there will be in the rollout of compliance assistant that hopefully will happen here in the next couple of weeks for the 2021 academic year. Under the sports tab, there will be an option for each respective sport, so make sure you're clicking for which sport it applies to. Eligibility exhausted, COVID-19. So again, just so that you're aware of how to log that in the system, that is one of the ways to be able to do that, and that's one of the changes that we made. Certainly there's changes in some other respective areas, but just as it relates to financial aid, just wanted to make sure I covered that with the group. One of the other things, it seems like we've gotten quite a few questions as it relates to what constitutes a reduction at the end of an academic year. So again, back in one of the earlier slides, as we mentioned, if you're not awarding the same amount as the previous academic year, it would be considered a reduction. So the simplest thing to do is not intermingle and mix if you're doing dollars versus percentages versus equivalencies versus words, whatever the case may be. So for instance, if you're awarding, and this is just one example, if you're writing it as dollars, and let's just say you're awarding $5,000, going back to one example, and the next year you still award that student athlete $5,000, even though costs have gone up, that would not be considered a reduction. So where it starts to get a little sticky again is when you're intermingling and matching and so forth. So you really just have to go back and look at how you are actually writing the award agreement for each respective student athlete to determine, whether or not that is considered a reduction. And with that, I will turn it over to Karen to address a couple of other questions.
Yeah, thanks, Angela. So we had a couple people ask sort of best practice or required process, I guess, for what you send to your returning student athletes. So, of course, many of our incoming student athletes will sign an institutional aid agreement in conjunction with an NLI or just an aid agreement by itself. And then what's necessary to send after that point? Can you just send a letter saying your aid's been renewed, or does it need to be something the student athlete actually signs? It does need to be an aid agreement that the student athlete's actively signing. It is a contract, of course, with the institution, and so you want to make sure that everyone's appropriately on notice, that it's been issued by the authority on campus, so your financial aid office, and it's been signed by that individual at a minimum. I know many others have AD or coach or other athletic staffers sign off, but then you do want to make sure that you're actively having your student athletes sign that aid agreement.
This does conclude our Division II specific sessions for regional rules for the 2019-20 academic year. We appreciate you all attending and hope you have a great rest of your day.